I've been writing about self-control for the past few months now. And every now and then, this comes up when I'm meeting new people or I'm talking to some friends. And what they often ask me is, how did I start writing about this topic? And what I tell them is that towards the end of last year, I was actually working on some more personal stories. And then I was doing quite a lot of reflection on growing up and kind of those kind of things. And while I was doing that, there was one specific topic that kind of popped up, and that was willpower. I think I was quite a self-controlled child. I was the kind of child that would kind of diligently do her homework, and I would keep my room tidy. And also, like when my family would be having some like kind of afternoon snack with coffee or tea, and everybody else would be having some sweet pastry, I would be like, oh, I want to eat something healthy. And I would opt for like a sandwich. And that's what I was like as a child. But then I'm still kind of pretty similar. So I'm like try to eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. I exercise multiple times a week. And then I read and write every morning. So when I was doing my reflections, I started to wonder how someone grows up to have high self-control. And as much as I really love writing kind of just those personal stories, I'm also really into kind of reading about psychology. And so I decided to check if there's any research on, like, particularly on how you like develop high self-control. And I started a deep dive, but I couldn't really find that much on like that angle. So I couldn't find that stuff specifically, but I bumped into something really interesting. And that was kind of research on what it means to have high self-control. And to me, as someone who identifies as having high self-control, what I was reading made sense, but it went against kind of the typical idea of what self-control is. So this is kind of like what I found is what I want to share with you today. And before I kind of start, I just wanted to say that I'm not a social psychologist. I studied design, so this is how um, I've understood the literature. So yes, how do we typically think? Like, what is usually thought of as self-control? So I think it's really thought of as this thing where, okay, I there's a cake on the table, so let me like not have it, or like you're trying to resist a temptation or an indulgence and really kind of control yourself. And then when I kind of looked into the research, I also found that there has been quite a lot of studies that have kind of just looked at what happens when people resist temptation. So this has also been the focus of the research. And there's a typical study where they will ask subjects to like do two tasks, and both of them are kind of about resisting temptations or using your self-control. And what they found is that when people have resisted temptation in the first task, for example, they are made to eat radishes, and at the same time, they have a bowl of cookies in front of them, or they're watching some kind of emotional movie. And then they're not allowed to show any emotion. So that's like the first task. And then they go to the second one. It's some kind of puzzle or anagram. People tend to perform less well in the second one. So what they've taken from that is that resisting temptations is tiring. Um, and this stream of research has been criticized quite a lot, but the reason I wanted to bring it up is that this is kind of what seemed to be the focus for quite a long time. And then when when I started looking more deeply into it, I found that more recently the focus has also been on the people who have high self-control. And there was one particular study that kind of seemed to really surprise the community. It's been cited about like over 1,000 times, and it came out in 2012. And the reason this was so interesting was that it was looking at everyday desire, and it was not done in a lab. So what they did was that they took about 200 Germans and they followed them for a week. And these people had some kind of device on them, and they got beeped, I think 7 times a day. And then every time they got this notification, they filled in a survey about any desire they may have kind of been experiencing at the moment. And also some like follow-up questions related to that. And that's kind of how it was set up. But then what they did was they controlled 4 different kind of personality traits and different things. And what they controlled for was also this thing called trait self-control. And before I kind of share what they found, I wanted to just say a few words about trait self-control, because I think it'll help understand the findings a bit better. So I think some of you probably know the big 5 personality traits. There's, for example, extroversion, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and so on. And somebody may have even done these kind of surveys online where you can assess how high you are on each. So trait self-control is studied in a similar way. So you get statements, and then you're asked how much you kind of relate to those statements. Some of the ones for trait self-control are, I'm good at resisting temptation, or people would say that I have iron discipline. So then when you've gone through all the statements, you can calculate a score. And then that's how high you are on self-control. So the cool thing about this is that it's been used like quite widely. And then we've been able to find some correlations with this trait. And it seems to be really quite desirable to have high trait self-control, because people who are high on this tend to do better academically. They like have better relationships. They have fewer impulsive behaviors and so on. And interestingly, they also seem to be quite happy, which is kind of cool to know. So now we understand trait self-control. So finally, let's go to like kind of what we found from this study. So most of the findings weren't that surprising. One of the main things that they found about everyday desire is that people are desiring something about half of their waking hours. So they want to eat, they want to sleep, they want to be in social contact, they want to use media. So all kinds of things like this. And on top of that, they also found, for example, that if you have a temptation and you try to resist it, this is actually surprisingly often successful. But then what they did was that they looked specifically at the people who scored high on trait self-control. And this is where it gets more interesting, at least in my opinion, because yes, these people are experiencing desires like anyone else, but their desires aren't as strong, and they don't rate as many of their desires as problematic. And what does that mean? That means that they don't really have that many temptations in the first place. And then they also found that they have less resistance towards their temptations. So this could be a bit confusing, because these are the same people that when they're filling in this other survey are saying that they're really good at resisting temptations. So what's going on? So I think there's a few ways to interpret this data. I'm going to share two. So the first one, of course, is that these people are just somehow really lucky. They're just kind of gliding through life and having it really easy and not having that many temptations. But then there's the other interpretation, which they share also in the paper, and that's that maybe these people, like what they're good at is not really resisting temptations, but avoiding temptations. And this is also backed up by other studies. So there are other studies that have found that people who score high in trait self-control, they have more automatic than controlled behaviors. And this is a fancy way of saying that they have more habits and routines. And there, I also found some other studies that found specifically that people who score high on traits of self-control have healthy habits around eating and exercising. So, all right, that's kind of what seems to be going on. So what should we make of all of this? I think, of course, if you don't consider yourself someone who has high self-control and you do have a lot of, like, do you experience a lot of temptations, you could be like, well, I'm not lucky like that. So what am I going to do with this information? But then I think there's the other side of the coin. So we could also be inspired by this. We could start to approach self-control a little bit differently. And we could think like, okay, so what are the situations in which I might easily fail at self-control? And are there ways in which I could try to avoid those situations? Maybe I can try to tweak my environment somehow. And then, of course, there's the part where if in any way possible, it would be good to develop habits around long-term goals. And that way kind of make it less likely that you will encounter temptations. So I think the way I prepared for this medium day session is maybe a good example. So I'm going to share that with you. So what I did was I found out that I was accepted, that I will have this session. And then, of course, I set out like, oh, I will prepare well in advance. And then every day I was like, tomorrow I will begin. And then time went by and I didn't start. And then at some point I was like, I really need to get started now. And the way I was approaching it wasn't working. So that's when I started thinking and I realized, well, I already have a habit in place, and that habit is writing. So every morning before work, I sit down at my computer and I will work on my Medium articles. That could be writing, it could be reading. It doesn't really matter, but I have like that slot. So I was working on a different self-control related article, and I decided, okay, I will pause that and I will start working on this one instead. And that worked. So then basically I was doing 30-minute sessions every morning, I think for like a week and a half, and I got it done. So this, what I've just described, I think is an example of what I've started calling meta self-control. And it's really about being strategic about self-control and planning ahead. And I think it also requires quite a bit of self-reflection. So it's not easy. I wouldn't say it's easy, but I do think that it is going to be easier in the long term than trying to resist temptations in the moment. So yeah, that was my official part, the end of my session. So I will check the chat now and see if there are any questions. Let's see. Nice to see people from all over the world joining. Really happy. Okay, somebody asked if self-control is the same as self-discipline. I would say yes. Of course, there's a slightly different kind of meaning to those words, but I think if we're just talking about it, I would use the word self-control, willpower, and self-discipline interchangeably. But of course, maybe the best one when it comes to the type of self-control that I was describing, I think maybe self-control is the best, but yeah, I've kind of started liking the word meta self-control myself. Okay, let's see. Earlier today, Nir Eyal said that 90% of the time, personal distraction starts from within ourselves. What's your opinion on that statistic when it comes to self-control? Are people more self-control, more aware of their unconscious um, inner triggers? I think that's a really good point. So, I haven't found any papers specifically looking at kind of self-control and self-reflection. Or actually, now that I'm saying it, I think there might have been one about metacognition or something like that. But I do think that what we know so far, it does seem like self-reflection probably is a big part of this more effortless type of self-control, because many of the kind of more strategic approaches to self-control, they do require you to think about like how you tend to react in different situations, what kind of patterns you have. And then I think it requires quite a lot of planning. And there is probably a case for that, that for some people it comes really naturally, like the example I shared about preparing for medium day. So it didn't immediately come to me like how I needed to approach it. But then, of course, deadlines work really well. So when you start having a bit more pressure, then maybe you become more creative on how to kind of implement those smart strategies for self-control. But yeah, I do think that it's very important to um, like have self-reflection. Can you explain that meta self-control a bit more? Yeah, so the idea of meta is that you're kind of thinking about the thing itself. So you are like kind of, there's layers. So if there's the regular type of self-control, then you have the outer layer where you're thinking about self-control. So that's meta self-control. So let's say you wanted to start doing, um, I don't know, push-ups. So then you could think about um, like situations in which like there's this idea of kind of combining one behavior with another. Um, it could be that while you put in the morning, you start brewing your coffee. While it's brewing, you do 5 push-ups. So then you would link your um, like your push-up behavior to brewing the coffee. So this is kind of something you could, for example, do some journaling on, or then you can just sit down and think, whatever works for you. But the idea is to be a bit more strategic about it. All right. What is the secret to this? Isn't self-control rather visible, or do you mean that people use habits and routines which you can't see, which make them seem highly self-controlled? Yeah, that was the idea here. I think so. If you're interested, you may want to I don't know, maybe my Medium article on this goes like explains this a bit better, but the idea is that like the secret word came from the idea that if we typically think that self-control is about resistance, um, then then the secret was that these people actually are not necessarily resisting temptation that often, but they're avoiding it. So that was the secret thing. And I also thought like there was one angle that I thought initially, like what I wanted to kind of include in the talk was that I think sometimes it might be interesting. Let's say you know someone close to you, a friend or a family member, or even an acquaintance that you meet every now and then, or a colleague. Um, if you admire them, that they seem to have like this massive self-control, I think it would be really interesting to ask them a bit about how they structure their days and how they go about pursuing their long-term goals. And a great way to ask is not just like, oh, like, why do you have such high self-control? But actually ask them like, hey, could you describe um, like the previous day? Or could you tell me a little bit more about how you go about making time for all of your hobbies or whatever? So then you might hear their secrets to self-control. And yeah, this is actually like the way to ask this question actually comes from user research, where you really want to focus on asking about specific past behaviors as opposed to some more general questions. Yeah, thanks for sharing the article. Right. How does one manage energy depletion, mental, psychic energy levels by exercising trait self-control? So I think the idea is that if you do this more kind of strategic approach, then hopefully you wouldn't be that depleted. So, for example, the example I've been now talking about how I prepared for this session. So I did find that it was quite depleting when I was just kind of moving this, like preparing for this session from one day to the next. So that's what was causing a lot of stress because I was like, I should get started, but then I wasn't getting started. But then once I figured out that, oh, I could work on this during my morning sessions, which I already have in place, then it reduced the anxiety a lot because then I was waking up in the morning and doing my regular morning routine stuff. And then I just like got started and I was like, oh, I'll put a timer. That's also something I tend to do a lot. So I put a timer for 30 minutes and then I set out to work for 30 minutes. And that's all I needed to do. There was no other kind of pressure kind of coming to me that as long as I can work on this for 30 minutes, I will be happy. And yeah, I think that will reduce the depletion. But yeah, the thing I was referring to in the beginning, the studies where they've looked at what happens when people resist temptation. As I said, it has been criticized quite a bit, and there are some studies that don't find this effect. But it does seem like if you're actively resisting temptation, then it does make you mentally fatigued and that you tend to perform less well than in other kind of mental tasks. Thank you for the courage and clarity to present without slides. That was my understanding of the original speaking format. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, and it seems like somebody maybe understood meta self-control better. Does dopamine detoxing support with self-control? I think maybe you're referring to these kind of dopamine fasts where you, let's say you're a bit addicted to social media and whatnot, and then you decide to take a break from it. I don't know enough about this to actually say anything definitive about it, but I have examined it in my own life that if I stay away from these things that kind of keep us really addicted and in the loop of kind of constantly checking things, we tend to get quite like fidgety and um yeah, so I do think it probably helps. But I think the problem with these are that if they're just temporary and then you go back to your normal um, kind of way of using, for example, social media, then of course, then you're back to the pattern that you had before. Um, yeah, I have thought about recently about this idea of time restricted digitalism. So I don't know, some of you may be familiar with the idea of time restricted eating, where you limit eating to a specific window. So let's say you eat breakfast at 7, so then you have a 12-hour eating window. And then the last meal you eat at 7 p.m. And then during the night, you're not eating. So I think one way to approach digital like use of digital products, for example, could be similar. So you could decide that you're only using them during a specific part of the day, and then towards, let's say, after 7 or 8 p.m., you start your digital fast, and then you're not using those products. So I think that could also help, yeah, even if you're not willing to kind of um, let go of it fully. Um, oh, nice to hear that some people are doing this. Yeah, I don't know if I missed any of the comments. We're also kind of running out of time. But yeah, maybe just a final note that, yeah, I have a few articles on self-control. So one angle that maybe I didn't get to cover in this one, which seems to be quite a big part of this kind of more effortless self-control, is intrinsic motivation, which is really linked to how much you um, like enjoy the thing you're doing. So it does seem like if you are enjoying what you're doing, um, self-control becomes more effortless just on its own. So I have one article that goes into the research on this, so I highly recommend checking that out. And then I have one article specifically on meta self-control and some of the strategies that seem to be teachable. So if you feel like you don't have any of these skills, maybe check that out, and then you can maybe like learn some of them and try to apply them in your own life. And let's see, I'm still working on some new stuff, which will be more about just some more like hacks and tricks for self-control, which are more for in the moment. Um, yes. Yeah, and thank you so much for joining. It was a pleasure to get to participate, and maybe if I join next year, I hope to see many of you there as well.